We can display by intensity. Sorry, before I do that, we can several of the display types like elevation, we can modulate by intensity. So we're changing the value and based on the intensity. So maybe I'll do that by class. It might be a little more apparent. That's another option that gets displayed, and you'll see, the greens will get a little darker or a little brighter, and the orange that's used for display ground gets a little darker or a little brighter depending on the feature that's in there, right? So that's one way of using intensity, is to apply a shading. The other way is we can display intensity directly. Let me turn off the image from the WMS layer in my map, so you get an idea what that is. Intensity is always something that is nicer to look at. It's difficult to look at when it's points. There's separation there. It's hard to see what things. So there's another option. So we have the legend, which controls what attribute is being used for display. And the other option is we have a display draw type. By default, it's draw by points. The next option is display a tin surface. And the tin surface will display whatever points you have loaded with whatever attribute you're displaying by. And so it's kind of is a nicer way to look at intensity. But it can also, if you've got a lot of data, tinning can take some time, particularly to tin to tin a lot of points that change elevations, and such as those through vegetation. Right? There are filters. So we had created or we had modified an all points filter, but there are some other filters that come with the data, and that controls what we're seeing. I'm going to bring it up in live view just so you can see what it does. Because it's live view, whether I change the filter here or change the filter here, it's going to make the change. And one of the other system filters that you have is to display just the ground points. And you'll see in the display it has changed, and it's changed because the ground point filter shows me that it's filtering on class where the point has to be a ground point in order for it to be displayed. And we can create any number of, we can create any number of filters. If we wanted to create a different filter, maybe a filter that just displayed our water points, then we could do that by, turning off all points, turning on just the water points, and saving that as a new filter, and maybe call that water. Not going to help us a whole lot in this data set because there aren't any water points. But you could do the same thing if you turned off all the points and created one that's just building. Maybe it makes more sense not to be tinning on the building and to show that by class. If we're going to change things, then you can see just the building points are showing now, and I could save that as a new filter and call that building. I think I already have one called that, so I'll just toggle to, I guess called mine buildings. Right, that's how that's set up. So that's how you can create your own filters. The ones that you create yourself from scratch are going to not say system beside them. So if you want to always have the default system filters available to you, then always save as a new filter. That's the best way to do it. And like I said, we can toggle between filters from the live view, or we can toggle between filters from the filter drop down in the main toolbar. So if I filter back to all points, or if I filter to just the ground points. Right. I'm now displayed by classification. I'm going to tell it to display the ground points using the tin model. And there's our shaded model of our ground surface. Right. LP360 has the capability of throwing contours on this. So there's a contour button in the middle, or a little bit to the right of the middle of the main LP360 toolbar. And a little Easter egg, if you hit Control and click on that, it will bring up the LAS layer properties, which can be also accessed by this page with the hand on it. That accesses the LAS layer properties because we're on the main toolbar. But control clicking on the button brings us directly to the symbology contours, and we can tell it to display contours. Maybe we'll use a half-meter interval. We can set a color for our index contours, and we can set a color for our intermediate contours. If we hit OK, that just sets the settings. If we toggle the button, then it will refresh the map with some dynamic contours. So if I make changes to the point cloud, these contours will change as well. There are two settings for contours. One is to display the contours as they are, so matching the data. And the other setting, and you'll see this in a few spots where the buttons are a kind of a tri-state button. There's the toggle, there's the toggle on and off, and then there's a drop-down arrow which says, oh, I've got options for this button. So in this case here, we can display just the contours, the engineering contours, or we can smooth those, where we'll smooth the contours for display, and that smoothing is based on this smoothing distance, where we're telling LP360 when creating the dynamic contours to ignore the points within that many map units distance in elevation of the contour interval that I've specified. That helps to not have a lot of points close to the contour interval that are pulling the contour back and forth. And I'm covering a lot of ground here. So I will pause here and check to see, are there any questions?
It's Martin here. We have had a couple of questions. I've been chatting with some of you guys in the chat, so hopefully that's helping. And do encourage you, do ask questions as we go along. I do want to kind of clarify one point that came up again, just because if some of you are newer to LIDAR or maybe not as experienced as LIDAR, just regarding overlap points. Derek was talking about flags and filtering for overlap points, but you may have noticed, or you may be more familiar with the fact that there's a point class 12 called overlap points. Maybe Derek, you can just pop up live view, which some of you may be more familiar with. So just a little bit of history here. Originally two classes of points: overlap points, so that is the points in the overlap between two flight lines, and model key points were separate classes. They were class 12 and class 8, as Derek's showing you here. But gosh, quite a few years back now, when the LIDAR-based specification guidelines were released by USGS, USGS made a change, and the industry rapidly followed, to not use separate classes for those. And the reason was because it was very simple. If you put a point in class 12 for overlap, you don't know whether that overlap point is a ground point, a building point, a vegetation point. So what USGS did, and as I said, the industry followed, is we moved these two designations of points to a flag system. So those are those flags that you can see there on the right-hand side of live view: key point, withheld, synthetic, and overlap. So in all modern LiDAR data sets, there are no points, or there's not supposed to be any points in class 12 or class 8, because those have been depreciated by USGS and USDA as well. And as a matter of fact, part of what we're doing with this LiDAR server program is modernizing some of the older data sets that do have points in class 12 and class 8 to move those into the appropriate class and flag them instead of using the classes. Sort of what we call modernizing the LiDAR data set. That's a bit of a long-winded thing, but again, for some of you that maybe have less experience with LiDAR or have worked with older LiDAR sets, and you're saying, well, I'm turning on, my overlap class on or off, or I'm not seeing any points in my overlap class, it's because those two classes are no longer used or are not supposed to be used. So just a little bit of explanation there. Now, toss it back to you, Derek.
All right. Yes, so there was a question, is there a way to set the contours to use only the ground points, but display the other classes? Yes, there is. And we'll do that next. It's a little bit of an Easter egg in here. I think it's not well spelled out on the dialogue. We're going to change that. If you notice on the live view, we have a renderer in the top left-hand corner. And the default renderer for the system filters is a merge renderer. And the merge renderer says, use the same filter for both the points and the tin. And the reason I said this is not very intuitive is because this is not a choice of one of three. It's a choice of either I merged or I am setting a tin filter. And if I set a tin filter, I can set my tin filter to display just the ground points. And I might also tell it to display the model key points, just in case model key points are classified in my data set rather than flagged. And when I do this, I've set what points will be used for the tin. When I then want to display my points separately, so I'm no longer using merge, which means I need to set both the tin and the points filters separately. And so my tin I've set to use classes 2 and 8. For points, I'm going to tell it to set the inverse of that. So I'm going to use the little invert button over here on the right hand side. That'll tell it to turn on all classes except for class 2. And like I said, in case we've got points classified as model key points, maybe I'll turn those points off as well. So now I have a filter that I've created that I have one set of filters for what points to display and one set of filters for what points to use in the tin. I make sure when I do that I don't click on merge again, otherwise it'll merge those back together and I lose the tin filter. So now I have a filter, my current filter I'm looking at, which it just says I'm modifying the ground filter, and that doesn't matter because it doesn't count until I save it, right? We're just on that filter at the moment. So now I have a filter that has rendered the points with a different set of classes than what I'm rendering on the tin. So let's save this filter as a new filter. And I usually call this my ground with points, because that allows me to display the tin using the ground and display all the other points that are not ground points. So I'm now on my ground with points filter, which you'll see then that the tin is using just the ground points, but I'm not seeing any points. And that's because you need to toggle the draw mode where we told it just draw the tin. So when I'm drawing just the tin, it comes off of just the tin filter. If I draw just points, then I will see just the non-ground points. And because I'm not displaying the tin, my contours still dynamically show, but now I'm looking at only the points that are non-ground points. If I want to look at both of those, then I change my draw method to draw points on tin. And now with points on tin, I'm going to have my tin model from just the ground, and then my points will be displayed. Let me just thicken those up a little bit in the display so you can see those points a little bit easier. So we have created, by separating out a tin and points renderer from, instead of using the merge renderer, we have created now a display method where we can specify what the tin model gets, what points are used for going into the tin model, and what points are used for display purposes. Let me close that for one moment. Somebody else had a question about changing the icons and text in LP360. In our, if I control click on the contour settings, then your annotation is in here. And if you wanted to show, if you want to show annotations, we can modify, and this allows us to change the text size associated and the mode. So if you look here, I'm going to reduce the size. So when I hit apply, my text becomes a little bit smaller. So anywhere that we allow you to display fonts, there's usually a annotation associated with it, and there's usually a font modify that'll allow you to set what font you're using, color, weight, style, that sort of thing. There's something similar in the labels, but I don't have anything that I can label up at the moment, but that would be the same thing. There'd be a similar font capability in the labeling if we use, if you have the show labels option where you're labeling off of some attribute in a shape file, that would be where you get that from. We may get some of those at some point, so I might be able to show you that. Other questions? Feel free to turn on your mic and chime in too if you'd rather do that than type a message. Somebody missed the flood zone piece. All right, no worries. I'm just gonna zoom back out. So the flood zone, let me just go back to displaying only points, and I will turn off my contours just to make the display a little cleaner. And I got my point size pretty big, so let me turn that point size back down and change my map, or change my filter back to all points. So flood zone mapping usually works based off elevation, so it makes sense to display the points by elevation. And then in live view, we can tell it to superimpose elevation ranges. So I might add a range here that is my flood zone 1, where I say that's anything below, I think I said 312, and pick some color for that. Oh, I did the, let me modify that because I clicked on above instead of below. So now you're seeing any points are being colored in yellow where the elevation of that point is below 312 meters. Of course, I've got, some yellow in the display, so let me pick something that's completely not going to be in that display. So I'll use magenta. There you go. Now it's a little bit clearer. Those are the points. So that is the area that would be covered with water, or probably would be covered with water if that lake rose to a level of 312 meters. I'm superimposing at the moment. I could also filter, and that shows me the area. And one of the things we're going to cover this afternoon is if I wanted a polygon to define that area, to show me what the extent of the flooding would be, we're going to show you a methodology that we could do that. The difference between what we're doing this afternoon is that we would use this filter for the source points on there. Does that answer that question for you? Great. All right. Again, I'm going to close out and not save any changes. I was just doing that for display purposes at the moment, so I'm not going to change. I'm not going to save that filter. So there's a very, very quick introduction to some of the capabilities of what we can do with filtering points, with looking at different attributes, with displaying in the map view. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a break here, and then we'll come back from the break. And we come back from the break, what we'll look at is, we're looking at elevation data. So let's look at some elevation, right? So let's look at it in the 3D viewer and the profile viewer and see what other capabilities that we get when we look at those views. Like I said, I only kind of touched on a whole variety of things here, but it gives you a little bit of introduction to some what we can do. I do highly encourage everybody to spend some time just toggling through, doing different things, changing different settings, and getting an understanding and feel for how this works. So let's take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at quarter after the hour and pick up from here. So I'm going to go ahead and just save my project as it is so that I'm zoomed out like this if I have to close out and come back in. All right. Thanks very much. I'll leave the session going, and we will see you in 15.